Story 1. The first time I heard it, I blamed the wind. Minnesota nights in April have a way of carrying odd echoes. Branches scratching old granite, raccoons rustling in the brush, maybe a deer brushing past the gate. But at 2 a.m. on the dot, it wasn't the wind or the wildlife that woke me from a shallow sleep. It was a sound so out of place that it sat me bolt upright in my cot. A cluster of keys, clear and sharp, rattling against each other. I waited, holding my breath, listening for footsteps, laughter, anything that would signal a prank or a late-night visitor. But there was only that patient, deliberate clatter, as if something, was weaving through the rows, shaking a heavy ring of keys just beneath the surface. At first I tried to reason with myself. There had to be an explanation, maybe a broken pipe, some piece of loose metal vibrating in the frost. But the sound moved. It began at the oldest part of the cemetery, where the stones lean and crumble, then traveled, unmistakably, along the line of fresh graves, pausing here and there as if stopping to select just the right lock. I opened the door to my shack and stepped outside, cold grass wet under my boots, heart pounding so loud I thought I'd drown out the sound itself. I followed the noise past the willow trees, past the little marble angel missing her arm, all the way to the edge of the northern plots. I stopped, squinting into the dark. The noise vanished as suddenly as it had come, replaced by the regular hush of wind in the pines. I forced a laugh, feeling foolish. Maybe it had been a dream. Too much black coffee before bed, too many stories traded with the old-timers about strange happenings in these fields. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been moving beneath my feet, threading through the soil, hunting for, I didn't know what. I slept fitfully, the sound replaying in my mind, always at the same hour, always just below the reach of explanation. In the morning, with the sun struggling through the gray, I told myself I'd imagined it. But that evening, as I locked the tools away and swept the porch, I glanced out toward the stones and shivered. The earth looked undisturbed. The air was still, but I couldn't shake the certainty that the night was waiting for me to listen again. And at the back of my mind, I wondered, what exactly was being unlocked down there, while the living slept? The day after that first night, I tried to lose myself in routine. I raked the paths, checked the mower's oil, ate breakfast at Betty's Diner on Main, like I'd done every Wednesday for 20 years. In a town this small, everyone knows you by your order. Coffee, eggs over easy, bacon burnt, Betty chirped, and I smiled, answering the usual questions about who'd died lately, what I'd seen among the stones. I almost told her about the sound, but there's an unspoken rule among people who live close to the dead. You don't invite curiosity unless you want it knocking at your own door. By the time I walked back to the cemetery, the morning sun had burned off most of the chill, but not the unease that clung to me like a cobweb. Around 9, I started my rounds, boots crunching on frost-stiff grass. I moved slowly, scanning for broken vases, fallen branches, any small sign of vandalism. When I reached the row where the oldest Civil War veterans lay, something odd caught my eye. A metallic glint, out of place atop Mrs. Duval's headstone, a granite slab I'd polished myself a week ago. I brushed away a scatter of pine needles and found it, a key, old and heavy, made of tarnished brass. It was cold as ice and perfectly clean despite the dew, as if it had been placed there only moments before. I turned it over in my palm. There was no tag, no label, just a tiny, perfect engraving on its bow, a spiral, like a snail shell, or the wind curling through the grass. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching, maybe one of the teenagers who sometimes dared each other to sneak in after dark. But the grounds were empty, silent except for a distant dog barking and the crows bickering in the poplars. I tried the maintenance shed, the chapel door, the lockbox by the main gate. None fit. The key was oddly shaped, too long and thin, the teeth jagged in a way I'd never seen before. It didn't belong to any lock I knew. I slipped it in my pocket, feeling suddenly foolish and a little unnerved, and finished my circuit. By noon, I convinced myself it was probably dropped by a visitor, someone sentimental maybe, leaving a token behind. Still, when I locked up for lunch, I set the key by my coffee mug on the desk in the back room just to keep an eye on it. It sat there, gleaming dully, And every time I looked up from my paperwork, I found myself tracing that spiral with my thumb, over and over. But that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, just after sunrise, another key appeared, this time on the border of the children's section, perched neatly atop a marble lamb. This one was silver, smaller than the last, but equally cold, and carved with a different symbol, a 5-pointed star. I shivered, glancing down the rows as if I'd catch someone in the act. The grass was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken stems. I checked the security cameras by the front gate, but the system blinked with the same error message it had shown since February. No signal. The third day, a copper key with a tiny clover. The fourth, a black iron one with a crescent moon. Each was perfectly clean, cold, and left in plain view atop a different headstone. I kept them in a drawer in the office, unable to bring myself to throw them away. I tried every lock in the cemetery, toolboxes, crypt doors, the rusted shed at the far end of the lot, but none gave even a hint of a fit. I asked around town, but nobody admitted to losing a key or even seeing anyone unfamiliar near the grounds. People teased me gently, assuming it was some prank by kids from the next county over. As the days stretched on, the pattern became impossible to ignore. A key appeared each morning, always somewhere new, always with a symbol I'd never seen before. Never a duplicate, never tarnished or dirty. It started to feel less like a prank and more like a message or a warning. But from whom? And for what purpose? No visitor complained of missing keys. No local locksmith recognized the shapes. The mystery began to gnaw at me, subtle at first, but then with a growing, insistent pressure. I started waking earlier, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was responsible, but I never saw a thing. After a week, there were 7 keys in my drawer, each colder than the last. On the 8th morning, as the mist clung low and the sun barely showed itself, I found a key resting on my own front step. It was heavier than the rest, made of gold that gleamed even in the gray light, and on its side was etched the outline of a door. No knob, no hinges, just a perfect rectangle cut deep into the metal. My hand trembled as I picked it up, feeling the chill travel up my arm. That was the morning I stopped thinking it was a joke. I locked my office and sat at my desk, staring at the collection. Each key felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve, and every instinct told me that somehow each new key was getting closer. Closer to something buried, if not in the ground, then somewhere much harder to dig out. And always, when the wind died down and the birds fell silent, I thought I could hear the faintest sound of metal ringing beneath the earth. Not random, not the work of animals or chance, but a deliberate, steady procession, chasing its own path. And every day I wondered, what would I do if I ever found the lock? Or worse, if the lock found me first? The drawer full of keys became a private ritual, a habit as compulsive as counting breaths. Each morning, before even unlocking the maintenance shed or checking the messages on the office phone, I'd walk the grounds, eyes scanning for that glint of metal on marble or the damp shine of brass against moss. I started carrying a notepad, recording the date, the symbol, the exact location where each key appeared. It felt methodical, almost scientific, though deep down I knew there was nothing logical about what was happening. By the end of the second week, there were 14 keys, no two alike, each etched with a sign I could not interpret, a fish, a cross, a single teardrop, a perfect circle. It was late Friday afternoon when I sat at my desk, keys spread out in front of me, notepad in hand. For the first time, I decided to plot their positions on the old map of the cemetery, a yellowed, hand-drawn thing from the 60s, faded pencil lines marking every row and section. As I penciled in each location, a shape began to emerge, not random. The keys formed a winding path that twisted through every section, north, then west, then back to the ancient family plots near the old mausoleum at the rear. The line wasn't straight, nor did it follow any of the graveyard's walkways. Instead, it snaked between rows, crossing over boundaries and plot numbers, always ending up back at the mausoleum, the one locked since before I was born. I hesitated before drawing the final key's position. The shape was almost deliberate, a spiral, echoing the mark on the first key. My stomach turned as I realized the path would take anyone following it right to the door of the mausoleum. a place every gravedigger before me had been warned to leave undisturbed. The door, cast iron and heavy as sin, had no visible lock. For decades it had been welded shut, the keyhole hidden beneath an ornate crest, tarnished green by age. That evening, after sunset, I wandered through the cemetery with a flashlight, tracing the line the keys mapped out. Each step felt heavier than the last. At the mausoleum, I pressed my palm to the door, cold, colder than the November air. I knelt, brushing away the moss and dirt, exposing the old crest, and beneath it, a narrow, corroded keyhole, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. My fingers itched to try one of the keys, but I resisted, not sure what I feared more, that one would fit or that all would fail. The days blurred together. The sound of keys beneath the earth became so familiar I started to hear it even when awake, a phantom clatter at the edge of my hearing. On the 15th morning, I found 2 keys instead of one on a veteran's grave near the entrance, the other balanced on the sundial at the far end of the grounds. The symbols now seemed to repeat, but subtly changed. The spiral now fractured, the teardrop elongated, the star with 6 points instead of 5. I mapped them again. The path on my notepad doubled back on itself, a maze with no clear exit, but always looping back to that same locked mausoleum. One night, unable to sleep, I spread the keys on the kitchen table and stared at them until my eyes watered. I turned them over, lining them up in order of discovery, tracing each symbol. The gold key with the door, the first key with the spiral, the newest ones with their strange, shifting marks. A pattern whispered in the edge of my mind, something I almost recognized but could not name. I started dreaming about keys. In the dreams, I wandered underground corridors lined with stone, the walls pressed in tight and damp. I walked with a ring of keys in my hand, unlocking doors that opened onto blackness, each heavier and more oppressive than the last. The clatter of keys followed me everywhere. Sometimes I'd wake with my hand clenched, fingernails digging into my palm, the imprint of a key's teeth pressed white against my skin. More than once, I'd find a key beside my pillow, its chill lingering long after dawn. Curiosity became obsession. Each time I mapped a new key, I felt a push to finish the path, to follow it step by step, as if the answer, whatever it was, waited at the end. The mausoleum, once just another landmark, began to dominate my thoughts. I imagined what might be behind the door. Old bones, treasures, nothing at all. Or maybe something older than any grave, something that had been waiting, patient, beneath the earth since before the cemetery was ever built. In the office, the notepad filled with my notes, I found myself writing the same phrase over and over without noticing. The way opens when the keys are set in order. I had no memory of writing it. My handwriting, but different, shaky, urgent. I tore out the page, crumpled it, threw it away. The next morning, the same words appeared again at the bottom of my notes, as if something wanted to remind me, needed me to finish the path. That night, the keys clattered louder than ever. They rang through my sleep, echoing up from the ground, a summons I could not ignore. When I woke, there was a new key, heavier than the rest, resting atop my work boots at the door. I picked it up, and for the first time, it was warm. Engraved on its bow was a single word, tonight. I looked at my map. The spiral was complete. The path led only one way now, to the mausoleum, to the door that had never been opened in my lifetime, the one that waited for the key that had just appeared. And I knew, in the marrow of my bones, that ignoring it was no longer an option. The sound of keys beneath the earth was no longer a question. It was an invitation, and I was the only one left to answer. Sleep was no longer a respite. It was a corridor lined with doors, each waiting for a key that felt heavier in my hand every night. From the moment I first touched one of those ancient, cold keys, my dreams changed. No longer did I drift through the fog of half-forgotten memories or wander idle visions of the past. Instead, I found myself beneath the cemetery, far deeper than any grave had ever been dug, walking through tunnels that pulsed with damp, heavy air. The walls were rough stone, impossibly old, marked with the same symbols that adorned the keys I collected by day. There were no lights, only a faint silvery glow that seemed to bleed from the stone itself, leading me onward. In those dreams, my footsteps made no sound, but behind me I could hear the steady, metallic jingle of keys on a ring. Sometimes I'd try to look back, to see if someone was following me, but I could never turn my head. The dream always forced my gaze forward, toward a series of doors embedded into the stone, each with a unique keyhole and a faint pattern that pulsed as I drew near. The first time I tried a key, my hand trembled so violently that I thought I'd drop it. The key slipped perfectly into the lock, as if it had been waiting centuries for that single motion. The door creaked open to reveal only darkness and the echo of distant whispers, names, half remembered, rising from the void. Each night, the path in my dreams grew longer, the doors more ornate, the symbols more complex. Behind some, I'd hear the soft weeping of children. Behind others, the harsh scraping of nails on stone. Once I opened a door and saw the outline of the mausoleum above, viewed as if from far below the earth, with the roots of trees curling around its foundations like the fingers of a buried hand. I woke from that dream gasping, the taste of earth in my mouth, and found one of the keys clutched so tightly in my fist that it had drawn blood from my palm. Increasingly, the barrier between dream and waking life began to dissolve. Sometimes I'd wake to find dirt under my fingernails, the smell of wet stone clinging to my skin. More than once I discovered that a new key had appeared somewhere in my room, atop my nightstand, under my pillow, once even lying across my chest like a warning. The symbols on the keys in my dreams always matched the ones I found in the real world the next morning. It became impossible to believe these were only dreams. One night, following the spiral mapped by the key's appearances, I stood before a door far grander than any that had come before. Its surface was black and glossy as obsidian, etched with swirling symbols and a single keyhole the size of my fist. I hesitated, feeling a pulse of dread as I raised the key, the newest, warmest, and heaviest one yet. The moment the key touched the lock, the whispers in the tunnel rose to a wail, a storm of voices calling my name, begging me to stop, to turn back, to wake up before it's too late. But I was already turning the key, the lock spinning easily, the door opening onto a void so complete it seemed to suck the air from my lungs. I awoke tangled in my bedsheets, gasping, my skin cold and slick with sweat. The key I'd held in my dream was real, warm in my palm. On the floor beside the bed, dirt had been tracked in, leaving a spiral pattern across the worn wood. I felt the irresistible urge to walk the cemetery, to trace the path one more time. But now, I saw doors in the shadows between graves, glimpses of ancient wood and iron half buried in the soil, and heard the soft click of tumblers turning just out of sight. The dreams grew more frequent, and I could no longer tell if I was opening doors in sleep or in waking. The mausoleum at the end of the spiral called to me, each night more insistently. I'd wake with the keys beside my head and the memory of voices echoing in my ears, voices of the dead, voices of those not yet buried, voices that sounded, at times, eerily like my own. All the while, the path on my map grew clearer, the spiral tightening, leading me to the single place every key seemed made for. And with each passing day, the sensation that I was unlocking something inside myself, some old hidden door, became harder to ignore. I knew, even as I tried to resist, that there was no turning back. The next key would appear, the next dream would come, and soon, the last door would open, whether I was ready or not. By the 5th week, the jangling of keys had become a constant undercurrent to my existence, a background noise that no longer confined itself to the boundaries of night. I heard it at noon, echoing from the roots of the old maple by the chapel. I heard it during burial services, beneath the hum of prayer and weeping. Most hauntingly, I heard it in the quiet moments, alone in my quarters, staring at the map of the cemetery, tracing the spiral with a trembling finger. The sound was everywhere, growing louder and more insistent, each metallic clink a reminder that the line between waking and dreaming had all but dissolved. There was no escaping it. The townsfolk began to notice that I seemed distracted, my gaze always half-turned toward a noise only I could hear. Sleep was elusive, for each time I closed my eyes, the keys were waiting. In dreams, they now floated around me like a constellation, dozens of them, old and new, some corroded by time, others glimmering with an uncanny sheen. When I reached out to grasp one, it would burn cold into my palm, and suddenly a door would appear, sometimes old and wooden, sometimes made of stone, always heavy and resolute, always unlocking at the faintest touch of the right key. Each door led somewhere different, a forgotten crypt, a corridor beneath the cemetery, a room lit by a single flickering candle where shadows moved with lives of their own. But each time I crossed a threshold, I left something behind, a name, a memory, the faint feeling that the world above was drifting further away. It was as if the act of opening each door was a barter, a trade between who I was and who, or what, I was slowly becoming. The real world was changing as well. The cemetery itself seemed to warp and flex beneath the pressure of the nightly ritual. New cracks appeared in the mausoleum. Old stones shifted and tilted, as if the earth itself was uneasy. The keys I found each morning grew more elaborate and more personal. One bore the insignia of my grandfather's toolbox. Another was etched with the initials of the first woman I ever loved, long buried in the south field. Sometimes the keys were warm to the touch, sometimes so cold they burned, but always they carried the unmistakable sense that they were meant for me alone. And always, the sound of keys. In the day, it echoed in my skull, an itch behind my eyes that no amount of distraction could alleviate. At night, it became a siren call, pulling me through corridors of stone and shadow, urging me to unlock doors I was no longer sure I wanted to open. The spiral path I had charted on my map tightened with each passing dream, each waking hour, leading inevitably toward the sealed mausoleum, a place the living never entered, a place I now knew was waiting for me. The final night arrived without warning. I lay in bed, listening as the sound of keys grew deafening, drowning out every other thought, every memory of sunlight or laughter or warmth. I rose, numb, my hands already closing around the latest key, a massive, ornate thing, heavier than any before. I walked the spiral path in the dark, the cemetery shifting around me, the world shrinking to the narrow thread of my footsteps and the clatter of metal in my pocket. When I reached the mausoleum, the door was already ajar, as if it had been waiting for this moment. I hesitated, but the sound of keys behind me was now a cacophony, a crowd of voices urging me forward, promising release, or oblivion, or something worse. I stepped inside, and the darkness folded over me like a burial shroud. The last thing I heard was the sound of the key turning in the lock from the other side, a final, decisive click that echoed through my bones. Then silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of something complete, something finished. In the cemetery above, dawn broke, and the sound of keys fell quiet for the first time in weeks. But if you stand by the old mausoleum on certain nights, when the air is thick and the moon is new, you might still hear the faint, unmistakable jingle of keys far below and feel for a moment that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Story 2. When you spend as many years as I have inside the same four walls, little changes stand out in your bones before your eyes even register them. My name's Glenn Lowry, 58, caretaker and gravedigger in Dalton, Iowa, a town that barely makes it onto state maps and whose cemetery, until recently, fit comfortably inside a yellowed mural above my battered desk. That map was as much a companion as the shovel in my hand, or the old radio that only played static after 8 p.m. Every inch of it was etched with my own notations, scrawled in pencil or pen across the faded boundaries. Here was the northern hedge that never grew right. There, the old Civil War section, and there, the corner where the soil still stank of kerosene from a decades-old accident. It's been years since anyone bothered to change anything, but on this morning, as I came in balancing coffee and my pile of new forms, I noticed a fresh, delicate black line running along the bottom right of the mural, a thin sweep curling outward like the start of a new road, barely visible, as if drawn overnight by a hand, careful not to wake the rest of the map. It wasn't a mistake, wasn't dust, and certainly wasn't something I'd done. I squinted and traced it with a trembling finger. The paint was slightly raised, shiny in the early light, fresh, but not wet. I called over Ted, the other gravedigger, whose idea of a practical joke never got more sophisticated than moving my boots behind the furnace. "You add something to the map, Ted." He just shook his head, eyes narrowed, lips pressed together. "Haven't touched that thing since the tornado cleanup." Same answer from Clarice, the office manager. No one knew, no one cared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the air in the office was heavier, that something just past the edge of my peripheral vision was quietly watching us all. As the hours passed, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of age, maybe a line I'd never noticed before. But as I stacked the week's new burial requests, the unease settled like wet cement in my chest. I walked the perimeter of the cemetery twice that afternoon, boots sinking in familiar mud, expecting to see some new construction, a flagged stake, a forgotten utility crew. But there was nothing. No sign of expansion, no new graves, not even a surveyor's mark in the grass. Still, when I returned to the office at dusk and glanced up at the mural, the line was there, sharper now, as if it had grown bolder in my absence, maybe longer. My coffee was cold by then, and I was sweating in my jacket despite the autumn chill. By the time I locked up that night, the new boundary felt like a splinter in my mind, a thin, intrusive thread weaving something new into the only place I'd ever called mine. I slept poorly, dreaming of maps that stretched off the edge of the world, of names and dates written in ink that ran like water, erasing what used to be and leaving only what someone, or something, needed next. And in the morning, when I walked back into the office, the mural seemed to be waiting for me. The line was no longer a stray mark. It was a border, and for the first time in decades, I felt like a stranger in the only world I'd ever known. The following days pressed on with the slow dread of a winter that never really lets go. Every routine in the cemetery colored by a mounting sense that I was waking up into a world slightly unfamiliar each morning. I'd catch myself pausing in the office before sunrise, keys in hand, staring at that mural like a man reading an obituary for a town he once loved. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was more tired than usual. Maybe the mural's lines had faded, and now, with the changing light, my mind filled in the gaps. But my excuses thinned each day, because every day brought something new to the map, something no one had drawn and no one could erase. It began with faint outlines, thin curling lines that arced away from the established boundaries of Dalton Cemetery, forking into new shapes and right-angled turns. One morning there was a new lane, barely wider than a pencil stroke, labeled Mayapple Row in a spidery hand I didn't recognize. The next, an entire side street, Ashen Lane, snaked up along the western edge, with a dozen tiny squares boxed in on either side. They looked like new grave plots, though the numbering made no sense, running backwards and skipping years at random. I pressed my finger to the cool plaster and felt my skin prickle. The writing wasn't mine, nor was it any of the familiar block script of the town clerk or my own looping scrawl. It was antique, almost ornate, curling each letter as if it had been scribed 100 years ago. I tried to laugh it off in the break room. "You seen the mural, Clarice? Looks like we're getting a whole new subdivision." She just gave me that patient look she reserves for the local drunks, bemused but cautious, like someone waiting for a punchline that might never come. I went outside and walked the full perimeter again, this time with a notebook. Nothing. The same crabgrass, the same broken stones, the same muddy ruts carved by the backhoe. Yet each time I glanced back through the window, the mural seemed to pulse at the edge of my sight. That afternoon, Ted burst in from the north gate, boots covered in clay, muttering about a trail he didn't remember, a half-paved path between two plots where, yesterday, there had been nothing but crabgrass. I followed him out, and sure enough, there it was. A footpath cut neatly between two rows of stones, like it had always been there, the mud freshly packed and undisturbed. No prints, no tire tracks, just a new path, exactly where Ashen Lane had appeared on the mural. By Friday, the changes were impossible to ignore. Entire new blocks blossomed on the mural overnight. Willow End, Fen Hollow, Juniper Bend, each with its own cluster of rectangles, each rectangle filled with a name I had never heard. H. Fitzwalter, 1932. Ruth Roan, 1886. B. Morrow, 1970. Names not in any burial log, not in any town census, not even in the old parish registers Clarice kept locked in her office drawer. They felt like names from someone else's memory, old ghosts with no living kin. The spaces for these new lots were drawn in such detail that I could see the shading of the hedges and the tilting of the old iron fence, sketched with a hand that understood how Dalton Cemetery breathed in summer heat and November frost. I decided to document it, taking daily photos with my phone, though each time, the glare on the glass blurred the new additions, rendering them as smears of light, as if the camera itself refused to acknowledge the growing map. I called the city office, trying to report unauthorized changes, but every clerk I reached assured me that the official records showed no new permits, no planned expansions, and no survey crews scheduled for Dalton. My emails bounced back with "recipient not found." When I pressed the city engineer, he sighed and told me the cemetery's last documented survey was from 1979, and that any new lines must be my own imagination. That night, I sat in my chair, staring at the mural, as the sun dipped behind the stained glass windows. I noticed something else. The area labeled "office" on the mural, always centered, always neat, now looked smaller. Just a tiny white square, shrinking a little each day as the rest of the cemetery sprawled around it, swallowing up its space. The office felt colder. My chair, once tucked neatly beneath the window, now seemed further from the door. I told myself I was being foolish, but the room felt different, compressed, as if the very walls were inching closer with every passing hour. At dawn, I brought a magnifying glass and examined the names. Some were almost erased already, the ink thinning at the edges, replaced by more recent additions. It was as if the mural was alive, growing, discarding the old to make room for the new. I traced the new streets with trembling hands, whispering the strange names like a prayer, hoping they'd vanish if I spoke them aloud. But as I did, the chill in the air grew sharper, and I realized I was not just witnessing a change in the map. I was watching the slow, deliberate rewriting of the only place I'd ever called home, and the part of the mural labeled "office" was now barely larger than a postage stamp, as if the map itself was closing in, a living thing swallowing its caretaker one brushstroke at a time. The pressure of dread only intensified as the mural expanded, swallowing familiar borders and replacing them with new, impossible geometry. The more I tried to resist, the more stubbornly the changes pressed on, seeping into every quiet minute of my days and into the uneasy hush of every night. It was Saturday when I snapped and decided to take back control, at least of the room, if not the grounds outside. I took down the heavy wooden ruler and a block of fresh white erasers from the desk drawer, determined to erase every spidery, foreign line the mural had accumulated. The room felt colder than usual, the walls slick with condensation. I pressed the eraser to the wall and scrubbed at a curve labeled "Juniper Bend." The pencil line smudged, but didn't disappear. Instead, another road sprang into existence just beneath it, and beside the new lane, 3 more lots unfolded, each one bearing a new name, as clear and crisp as if they'd been carved into marble. I stopped, heart pounding. The eraser, now sticky and blackened, was losing its shape, and my hand tingled with pins and needles. I tried again, this time harder, working at a line called "Willow End," trying to return the map to what it had always been, a simple plan, honest and finite. As I rubbed, the wool seemed to hum beneath my fingers. The mural shimmered, and the erased section bled into the plaster, leaving in its wake a new, darker branch stretching off into a part of the room that hadn't been mapped before. With every desperate attempt to undo the growth, the map pushed back, doubling its sprawl. Tiny tombstones, perfectly shaded, appeared along new paths, each one labeled, each one encroaching closer to the corner where my desk stood. Soon, the mural stretched almost to the ceiling. The office label on the map was barely discernible, now hovering in the upper left corner, surrounded by a thickening tangle of alleys and squares. Even the clock above the doorway was bordered by a new avenue, Fog Row, with miniature lots dotted along its curve, each one empty, but only for now. I tried to ignore the encroaching lines, tried to focus on the work outside, but every time I turned my back, the map seemed to pulse with new growth, like an infection the body can't fight off. By Monday, I'd abandoned the eraser. Instead, I brought in sheets of brown butcher paper and thumbtacks, covering the mural in an attempt to halt the spread. But by the following day, the paper itself had become part of the mural. its surface blooming with lines and names that had not been there before. The map now extended onto the door, crawling along the frame, the names multiplying, always in that same elegant, unrecognizable hand. The world outside remained unchanged, or so it seemed, but each time I left the office, I felt the strange certainty that the cemetery beyond was subtly, dangerously different. The paths were a little longer, the air a little colder, the old familiar oaks on the west fence now shading new, unnumbered lots. Sleep became elusive. I would wake to the soft sound of a pencil scratching and find on the opposite wall more names, more grids, more roads spiraling outward from the tiny white square marked office. The original boundaries had vanished, erased by the growth. The mural's lines pressed against the corners of the room, eager to escape into the rest of the building, into the very reality of Dalton Cemetery. And the more I resisted, the faster it spread. One morning I found the bottom edge of my desk outlined on the wall, as if the office itself had become a feature of the map, marked, mapped, and nearly erased. I felt my own name rising in my throat, afraid to speak it lest it too appear somewhere in the swirling maze. By then, I had stopped trying to fight it. The map was alive, inexorable, feeding on my resistance, growing stronger every time I reached for the eraser. All I could do was watch as the last unclaimed space on the mural, my space, began to flicker, threatened by the steady, relentless crawl of new roads, new names, new graves. And in the quiet of the office, with only the scratching of phantom pencils for company, I realized the cemetery was no longer confined to the land outside. It was spreading through me, through the place I called home, until nothing would be left but names, lines, and the impossible, endless expansion of the map. By the end of that grim week, I started noticing subtle changes outside that left me doubting my own memory. It began innocuously, a sign at the corner of the cemetery road reading Mulberry Lane, nailed to a post that hadn't existed the day before. The name matched one that had appeared overnight on the wall map, sketched in that now familiar, delicate script. I tried to rationalize it, a prank maybe, or the city finally getting around to updating their signage. But no one in town mentioned a change, and Public Works denied any recent projects. But that was just the beginning. The next day, I found a narrow gravel path where there had only been a patch of weeds. The path wound through the oldest section of the grounds, exactly as it did on the new mural lines. At its end, I saw a row of small, freshly dug plots, dirt still loose, grass not yet grown over. Each bore a stake with a laminated tag. I bent to read the names. They were the same as those that had surfaced on the wall. Names I'd never seen in any town registry, never heard in church or at the grocer's, never known among the living or the buried. But here they were, real, manifest, undeniable. Worse still, my regular route through the cemetery started to change. I found myself walking a little farther each day, needing more time to finish my rounds. A new alley appeared, shaded by an unfamiliar row of trees. The mausoleums on the far end, once bordering an iron fence, now looked out onto a new expanse of headstones, stretching farther than I remembered, their dates impossible, some even listing years in the future. Each night, the moon seemed to rise over a broader field of stones. It wasn't just the landscape. The office itself began to feel untethered, as if it were drifting away from its foundation, further isolated at the center of this swelling necropolis. I'd step out and lose sight of landmarks I'd relied on for decades. New benches and statues appeared in places where, the day before, there had only been wild grass. An ornate wrought iron gate, decorated with symbols I couldn't decipher, now separated a section labeled Shoreline Row, a street I was certain had never been on the grounds before, except, of course, on the mural. The scariest moment came the morning I found a brand new headstone at the farthest border of the grounds. No earth had been turned. The marker was pristine white marble, the name carved with the same otherworldly precision as on the map. Elijah Parr, B. 1963, D. The death year left blank. I checked every record in the office, called the funeral homes, even asked around town. No one knew an Elijah Parr, yet there he was, etched in stone. His lot now a part of the cemetery both in the world and on my ever-growing map. That night, unable to sleep, I went to the mural with a flashlight. The street, Shoreline Row, was no longer a new addition. It was crowded with lots, each with a name, some familiar, most not. I traced the names with my finger, hoping for some logic, some order, some mercy. But the pattern was chaos, a fractal tangle with only one constant, the shrinking space labeled office, now surrounded on all sides by a maze of freshly inked roads and graves. My own name was not yet written, but it felt as if the mural was simply waiting, patient and inevitable, for the day it would add me to its cartography. In the end, it was clear that the map was no longer a record of reality. It was a blueprint, a prophecy. Each name, each road, each lot that appeared on the wall would soon appear on the earth outside, whether anyone alive remembered them or not. The cemetery had outgrown its old borders, and I, trapped in the shrinking office at its center, could only watch as the world around me was rewritten in lines, names, and cold, relentless stone. On a bleak Wednesday morning, with clouds hanging so low I could almost touch them, I stood in front of the mural that now engulfed almost every inch of my office walls. The only untouched spot, a tiny, trembling rectangle, was the shape of my own office, labeled caretaker's room, barely the size of a fingernail. Every other centimeter was overrun by winding roads, named courts, crescent-shaped avenues, and rows upon rows of lots, each bearing a name that, with horrifying certainty, would soon materialize in the graveyard beyond my door. It felt like standing on the last island above a rising tide, watching the water swallow the world, inch by inevitable inch. Sleep had become a memory, replaced by the anxious ritual of checking the mural each dawn. No matter how late I stayed up, no matter how many times I circled the grounds outside, every morning brought new ink, new names, new lines creeping into the only space that still belonged to the living. At first, I tried to resist, taping sheets of butcher paper over the mural, drawing heavy black X's through the new additions, even turning my desk to the wall in a useless gesture of denial. Nothing helped. The mural expanded beneath the covers, spread across the ceiling, crept behind the filing cabinets, its edges always seeking, always hungry. I called the town clerk, the parish priest, the oldest undertaker I knew. No one could explain the new plots, the multiplying names, the spreading streets. They listened, politely or impatiently, but no one came to see. Perhaps I began to suspect. The office itself had started to disappear for them, the way it was shrinking on the map. The phone rang less often. Deliveries stopped arriving. Visitors, relatives, mourners, even florists stopped coming inside, as if drawn away by an instinct they couldn't explain. In the final hours, I watched as the mural's creeping border closed in on the last white space. My name appeared, in that same beautiful, alien handwriting, along the top edge. Samuel Cobb. It hovered above the caretaker's room, unclaimed but inevitable, a threat or a promise. The rest of the map swelled to surround it, a dense web of roads, tombs, crypts, and names, many now matching stones outside, many yet to come. I found myself remembering the feeling of my first day here decades ago, when the office had felt safe and central, the map a tool of order. Now, it was an engine of erasure. That night, I locked the door and sat at my desk with my old lantern, watching the walls breathe in the weak, flickering light. The mural seemed to pulse, as if the map itself was alive, anticipating its victory. I tried to write my resignation, to record what had happened, but every page came out blank. The pen's ink wouldn't take. My handwriting dissolved on the paper as soon as I finished a word. Even the typewriter jammed and hissed when I typed my own name. I tried to leave. The handle turned in my hand, but the door wouldn't budge. I pounded on the window. Nothing but the endless graveyard stared back, now so much larger. The old gates, a distant memory. I sat on the floor, back pressed against the shrinking outline of the caretaker's room on the wall, as the mural's lines spilled down to the floor and snaked beneath the rug. In the final minutes, I saw my name slide from the border of the office into a new lot, centered, prominent, freshly inked among the dead. The light faded. The office shrank to a pinpoint, and the world outside, the map outside, grew to fill every crack and seam. In the last instant, As everything inside and out became one seamless expanse of stone and silence, I heard the scratching of a pen and felt, rather than saw, the final line written, "Caretaker, Samuel Cobb, last recorded." After that, there was only darkness and a map with no blank spaces left. Story 3. My name is Charles S. McKay, and for the last 16 years I've been the only gravedigger at Pine Hollow Cemetery, a patch of earth older than the town itself, stretching into the misty woods on the edge of southern Minnesota. It's the kind of place where the headstones lean like tired men. The dates on the oldest markers so faded you have to trace the grooves with your fingers to guess at their meaning. Most nights my routine is set in stone. Lock up the maintenance shed, check for stray deer by the west fence, and walk the rows until I see my own porch light blinking through the trees. But on a Wednesday in early fall, when the air carried the bite of frost and the moon hid behind thick clouds, everything changed with a flash I still can't explain. It was exactly 11:17 p.m. I remember because I'd just checked my wristwatch, annoyed at how late I'd let the paperwork keep me in the office. I was locking the door when I saw it, a shaft of white, blinding light, cutting straight through the fog at the far end of the western plot, where nobody ever went anymore. For a second I thought it was a truck's headlights, maybe a prank, but it was too high, too still, too clean. The beam fell directly on an old grave, one I'd barely noticed before. A moss-eaten stone so weathered the name was almost gone, just the hint of a J left curling along the base. I squinted, shielded my eyes, and tried to snap a picture with my phone, but the screen stayed black, refusing to focus. My heart hammered as I ran across the grass, dew soaking my boots, expecting the light to fade. Instead, it grew brighter, so pure and sharp it cast deep shadows from the crosses and statues all around, everything bathed in silver. For a minute, no more, no less, the whole world seemed to narrow to that single patch of earth, the silence so thick I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I wanted to call someone, to shout for a witness, but the words caught in my throat. Then, as abruptly as it started, the light blinked out, not faded, just gone, like a switch thrown. I was left standing in the dark, eyes stinging. The afterimage of the tombstone burned into my sight. Every flashlight, phone, and security camera I checked later was useless. All I had were minutes of static or empty black frames. Back at the house, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of exhaustion, maybe a rare car on the old service road. But the way the light had moved, the way it seemed to pick out that single grave in a sea of 1,000, stuck with me all night. I barely slept, haunted by questions I couldn't answer. Why that grave? Why that hour? And why me? As dawn crept over the fields, one thing was certain. I would be back at 11:17 the next night, watching, waiting, searching for any sign that what I saw was real and not some midnight fantasy conjured by a lonely old caretaker's mind. But what I found the next morning would shake me far more than any light in the night ever could. By the time sunrise burned away the last of the mist, I was already out in the west plot, boots caked in mud and hands trembling, still half believing I'd find nothing but my own footprints and the same forgotten stone. Instead, the grave that had stood at the center of that blinding beam was changed. The moss was scraped clean from the inscription, as if a careful, invisible hand had polished away decades of neglect. But the strangest part was the name. It wasn't what I remembered. Yesterday, the marker was nearly illegible, maybe a J. Har, and nothing else. Now the name was crystal clear. Jonathan Parker, born 1897, died 1932. The dates were crisp, and someone had etched them recently, the stone almost gleaming in the early light. I double-checked the records back in the office. There was no Jonathan Parker in the burial books. No Parker family ever laid to rest here. Not in the last 100 years. I paced up and down the row, comparing the stone to old maps and photographs I'd filed away. None matched the current arrangement. Even stranger, I noticed that a headstone 2 rows behind, an elderly woman's grave I'd cleaned every autumn for as long as I could remember, now had a different name and a date of death changed by exactly 3 years. It made no sense. Stones don't rewrite themselves, and families don't replace markers in the dead of night without leaving a trace. For the next 3 days, I forced myself to stay awake, notebook and pen ready, recording everything. Each night at exactly 11:17, the light returned, shifting to a new grave every time, never hitting the same spot twice in a row. Sometimes the change was small, a middle initial gone, a birth year adjusted. Other times, the entire stone would be replaced, a new name where there'd been a friend's or neighbor's before. The grass stayed undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of anyone coming or going. The town started to notice, too. A woman came to lay flowers for her sister and burst into tears when she saw a stranger's name on the stone. A man called the office, angry that his father's resting place had moved overnight. His family plot now sat in a different row altogether. I lied, said it must be vandalism, promised to look into it. But in truth, I was terrified. Every night, the light returned. Every morning, something in the cemetery was quietly, impossibly changed. The worst moment came when I opened my ledger and saw one of the old entries, my own handwriting, neat and blue from 20 years ago, crossed out and rewritten in a tight looping script that wasn't mine. It named a burial I'd never performed, in a lot I never dug. The more I tried to fix it, the more things seemed to slip away. Dates, names, histories, all unraveling, all erased by the quiet, relentless light that returned at 11:17 p.m., erasing memories and leaving only silence in its wake. Sleep became impossible as the days blurred, and the tension in my chest grew tighter with every passing evening. Every night, precisely at 11:17, the light would pulse into existence. A shaft so pure and bright, it painted stark shadows across the stones and trees, swallowing the night's darkness for exactly 60 seconds. I tried every trick, hidden cameras, motion sensors, even sitting in the window of my tiny office with a Polaroid in hand. But every attempt failed. Devices froze, film turned black, and my own eyes watered painfully whenever I tried to stare straight into that impossible glow. Each minute felt longer, stretching out as if the world itself was being remade beneath its radiance. After the first week, I realized the light never chose the same grave twice in a row. It danced through the cemetery in an order I couldn't decipher, skipping from an old soldier's stone to a forgotten child's plot, then to a weathered marker so old the inscription had once been erased by time, until the light touched it and the carving returned, sharp as a new wound. I mapped the pattern every night, but no logic emerged, no connection I could trace. Each time the light faded, I'd find the marker changed. Some stones grew new dates, others lost names altogether. Sometimes a headstone appeared in a new spot, the earth around it undisturbed, as though the cemetery itself was shifting under my feet. People in town began to talk. Families would show up in the morning, flowers in hand, only to find their loved ones' names erased or replaced. Rumors swelled. Curses, ghosts, a government project gone wrong. I kept my mouth shut. What could I say? That I'd watched it happen, powerless, night after night. That each time I tried to stop it, I felt a cold pressure on my chest and heard a sound like distant static, growing louder the closer I got to the light's epicenter. The minute itself became a ritual. I'd feel a tingle at the back of my neck, a pressure in the air, and then the whole cemetery would hold its breath. As the light flared, I'd see shadows moving in the corners, nothing distinct, just the suggestion of motion, as if someone or something walked among the graves. But when the minute ended, there was only silence and the slow returning of the darkness, leaving me alone to wander the rows and tally up what had shifted. Each change was irreversible. The cemetery's history, once fixed and sacred, was now a living, restless thing, rewriting itself, one blinding, unphotographable minute at a time. I thought I was the only one truly seeing the changes, that perhaps it was all a symptom of too many years among the dead. But it wasn't long before the living began to notice as well. It started when Mrs. Callahan, a widow in her 70s who visited her husband's grave every Sunday, arrived on a dew-soaked morning clutching a bouquet of white lilies. I saw her stop short, bending down, blinking furiously at the newly shined surface of the granite marker. She called for me, her voice strained, on the edge of panic. I hurried over, heart sinking with the certainty that something had changed overnight. When I joined her, she pointed at the stone, her gloved hand trembling. "This isn't his name. That's not my Gerald," she whispered. I leaned in and saw it, clear as day. Her husband's first name had shifted by a single letter, almost unnoticeable, but enough to feel wrong in the mouth. The birth date, too, was off by a year. She fumbled through the photos she always carried in her purse, proof for herself that she wasn't losing her mind. In every picture, the stone was as she remembered it. But now, standing in the morning sun, it was not. Others soon began to come forward. A young man who swore his grandfather's epitaph was gone, replaced by an empty patch of stone. A family who found an unfamiliar last name where their daughters had always been. I became a secret keeper, fielding their frantic questions, holding up my hands, helpless to explain. I considered showing them my notebook, the list of changes I'd tracked with the exact times and dates, but something always stopped me. A sense that sharing too much might make it all worse, might give the phenomenon more power. As the weeks rolled by, a quiet panic took hold of the town. Fewer people visited after dark. Rumors multiplied about haunted stones and ancient curses. My sleep grew lighter. Sometimes I'd wake to find new entries in my own notes, in handwriting I didn't remember, as if I'd written them in a dream. Each night, I waited for the flash at 11:17, and each night the light's target was a mystery until it landed. The next morning, I'd search for the newest alteration, dreading the day when it would be my own name, or the names of those still living, that disappeared from the world, leaving only a blank stone and a story no one could remember. The closer I came to understanding the pattern, the more the boundaries between memory and erasure blurred, as if the cemetery itself was testing how much I would notice, how long I could endure before I, too, was edited away. That final week, with my notebook now full of names that no longer matched any living person or documented death, I resolved to sit vigil through the night beside the cemetery's oldest grave. The stone was a squat slab of slate, its dates eroded, but the name was unmistakable. Sarah E. Willoughby, the town's first midwife, buried here since 1873. No one had visited her for decades, but her marker had survived every storm, every renovation, every careless mower blade. I picked this grave because if anything in the cemetery was real, if anything was immune, it would be Sarah's. The air was unusually still that night, the kind of deep velvet silence that settles when every animal knows better than to move. I watched my breath curl in the cold, eyes flicking from my watch to the sky, waiting for the light. When it finally came, it was as blinding as ever, a pillar of cold white that seemed to pour from nowhere, illuminating Sarah's stone so brightly it hurt to look at. For a full minute, I sat transfixed, my shadow stretched and thin against the mausoleum wall, the grass around me frosted with a quick, glimmering dew. And then, as suddenly as it began, the light vanished. I waited for my eyes to adjust, blinking the afterimage from my vision, and looked for Sarah's name, ready to jot down what had changed this time. There was nothing there. Not her name, not the dates, not even the stone. The spot where she'd lain for 150 years was only churned earth, a patch of uneven grass, as if someone had dug her up in the night and smoothed the soil behind them. No trace in the records, no mention in the registry. My own notebook had an empty page where my previous notes about Sarah had been. A page I knew had been filled only hours before. In a panic, I ran from marker to marker, searching for any proof she'd existed. But each stone looked more faded, more uncertain. When dawn finally broke, I found myself sitting in the center of the clearing, the light around me softer now, as if the world itself was already forgetting the event. At the office, I rifled through the files, desperate, but her folder was gone. The drawer stuck as if glued shut. Not even a ghost of her remained, except for a faint, muddy footprint near where the stone had been, as if someone had stood there watching me, before stepping back into the dark. And so the ritual continued. Every night, a flash. Every morning, something less. I kept waiting for the light to come for my own stone, for my own records. The town stopped sending mourners at night. The stories, the names, the very history that made the cemetery sacred. One by one, they flickered out. No one but me seemed to remember that they'd ever been here at all. And now, as I lock the gates for what feels like the last time, I'm not sure if this place ever truly existed, except perhaps in the single blinding minute of 11:17 when the world is washed clean, and all that's left is the memory of a name you can almost, but not quite, recall. Story 4. Every Monday, like clockwork, I see him coming down the dirt lane that leads to the iron gate of the cemetery. A man whose age seems carved out of time, his back only slightly bent, his hands clasped politely in front of his faded jacket. There's nothing remarkable about the way he walks, except perhaps for the slowness, as if he's savoring the morning chill more than most. The first time he appeared, I was trimming the hedges near the south entrance, sweat on my brow despite the weak Minnesota sun, and he startled me with a gentle cough, asking, "Could you help me find a grave?" His voice was as soft as a hymn. I said, of course. Dozens of people visit here every week for similar reasons, after all. And he thanked me. But when I pressed for a name, he blinked slowly, the blue of his eyes watery, uncertain. I can't quite recall, he admitted, searching my face for help he couldn't define. It's someone important, I think. He never brings flowers, never a photograph or a slip of paper with details. Just the same question, each week, and the same confusion. What name are we looking for? He stands with me at the edge of the older sections, surveying rows of weathered stones and moss-eaten angels, and sometimes he gestures, as if a memory is just out of reach. It might have been here. Or was it? But when we walk closer, his certainty crumbles. Sometimes he apologizes. Sometimes he shrugs and offers a rueful smile. The ritual always ends with him promising to remember by next Monday, though I know by now that he won't. I try to be patient. There's a sadness about him that clings to my mind after he leaves. He thanks me each time, never by name, just a gentle, "Thank you for your time." Some weeks, I notice something different about him. His hair a little less gray, the lines around his eyes softer, his steps less labored. At first, I chalked it up to tricks of the light, but as the months tick by, the changes become harder to dismiss. One Monday, he looks 10 years younger than the week before. His jaw firmer, his posture almost proud. His jacket is suddenly a size too small. The townsfolk don't seem to notice him, or maybe they don't want to. Once, I asked the pastor if he recognized the man, showed him a vague description, but he just shook his head. "There's always someone searching for the past here," he said, "but we don't always know if they're searching for themselves." Every Monday, I find myself looking out the window at 9 a.m., listening for the light scrape of shoes on gravel, half expecting the old man, no, not so old anymore, to appear. And every Monday he does, looking a bit more like someone I used to know, though I can never quite place him. The unanswered request is always the same, and so is my own helplessness. I wonder sometimes if he's searching for a grave that was never here, or if the name he's forgotten is his own. After several months of this Monday ritual, I began to take notes. Not in the official registry, but on slips of paper and in the back of my own battered notebook. I started by jotting down his clothes, the color of his hair, the tremor, or lack of it, in his hands. Each week, I saw less of the frail old man and more of a man in his late 50s, then early 40s, and, impossibly, younger still. His hair lightened from ashen white to a nondescript brown, the creases around his eyes smoothed out as if erased by careful fingers. He moved more easily. There were days, by late spring, when he hardly seemed older than me, maybe 40, maybe 35. I tried not to stare. I tried not to let my mind wander into the territory of the unnatural. The change was subtle, but relentless. Each time I greeted him at the gate, I felt a growing unease, like watching a film played in reverse, the subject slipping further away from the story I thought I understood. It didn't help that the townspeople never mentioned him. No one else at the cemetery, not the mourners, not the stonemason, not the delivery men, seemed to notice the same man coming and going, looking younger every time. I became obsessed with the archives in the office, leafing through old visitor logs, registers, and, finally, boxes of black and white photographs dating back decades. At first, I told myself I was just being thorough, making sure there wasn't a medical issue I was missing, or that this was all some long-running local prank. But when I found a photo from 1978, my breath caught. There he was, unmistakable, even under a different hairline and softer features, standing in front of a row of graves, his hand on the shoulder of a woman in mourning. The name written on the back didn't match anything he'd told me. Another image, dated 1961, showed him even younger, in the background of a funeral procession, eyes fixed on the camera. Year after year, every decade he appeared. Never central, never obvious, but always present. Somehow, he never changed after the photograph was taken. His face, captured on faded paper, remained exactly as I'd seen it on the morning of that week's visit. Even when the photo itself was more than half a century old, it was as if the man who visited the cemetery was slipping backward through time in plain sight, and the proof had always been tucked away in drawers and dusty files, waiting for someone to notice. One Monday, I brought up the photographs, nervous and unsure. He glanced at them with a detached curiosity, never quite recognizing himself, or perhaps refusing to. "That's a good likeness," he said once, smiling. "I wish I remembered more," but it was clear he remembered nothing. Or maybe, after so many years and so many names, there was nothing left to remember. The only evidence that tied his story together was the face that kept reappearing in the same cemetery, year after year, while the world outside continued to change. My curiosity became compulsion, pushing me deeper into the brittle ledgers and led by the soft scratch of my own pen in the silence of the cemetery office. I started cataloging every anomaly, every week, every visitor log, every page in the burial registers. Soon it became clear that not only did the man himself change, but so did the story of those he claimed to seek. It began with small inconsistencies. A first name that didn't match from one Monday to the next, a surname that swapped places with another, dates of death that quietly adjusted by a year or two when I checked back days later. I thought at first it was fatigue, my own memory failing in the press of routine, but the patterns grew too elaborate, too self-contained to be dismissed as clerical error. I started keeping a list on a legal pad under my desk. Every name the visitor asked for, every variation, every new or vanished detail. What unsettled me most was the discovery that some of the names he provided, week by week, were not found in any record, not in the register of the dead, not in city birth or death certificates, not even in the local obituaries archived at the library. Yet, when I would return to the registry later, sometimes the names I had written in my notes now appeared in the official burial ledgers, slotted neatly among the dates, as if they had always been there. Worse, these names were never static. One Monday, he would ask after Helen Margot, but by the next, the registry had replaced her with Maggie Ellison, and my own notes would carry both names, side by side, with identical burial dates and plot numbers. I'd flip back through the register, only to find that Helen Margot had never existed at all, except in my handwriting. Sometimes, little handwritten annotations appeared in the margins, in a faint foreign script, always near the shifting names, cryptic lines like, "He still searches," or "No memory left." At night, when I closed the office and locked the registry in its safe, I'd feel as if the words were still changing on their own behind the steel, quietly shuffling themselves, like cards in an invisible game. The more I chased a pattern, the more the record seemed to resist. It became clear to me that the visitor had not just cycled through identities. He had been folded into the story of the cemetery itself, a fixture in its endless reshuffling of loss and remembrance. There was no way to pin him down. Each attempt I made to draw a line, each cross-reference I assembled, only served to scatter the names further, like ashes in a stiff wind. I began to realize that the man did not just forget his name each Monday. The cemetery itself seemed determined to forget him as well, rewriting the narrative each week to keep his presence as fluid, as rootless, as a memory that slips away the harder you try to hold onto it. And yet, the more the names changed, the more I found myself obsessively returning to the ledger, as if I too might vanish if I ever stopped looking. It was a Monday grayed by a steady drizzle, the sort of morning that soaked through your jacket before you could even cross the gravel lot. The visitor came as always, but there was something different in the way he moved. He looked younger now, his back less bowed, his voice less tremulous, his eyes unsettled and searching. His hair, now a muted brown rather than silver, was slicked down by the rain. He stood at the gates with a peculiar urgency, wringing his hands as though a name hovered on his tongue, just out of reach. "I think today I might finally remember," he told me, his voice so steady it startled me. I found myself agreeing to walk the rows with him, hoping this time something would resolve, some gap would close. We walked slowly between the stones, my boots sinking slightly in the wet grass, the man glancing side to side, murmuring almost to himself. He would pause at certain names, sometimes names that hadn't been there last week, and tilt his head as if listening for a familiar whisper. His hand hovered over the granite, his eyes flickering with flashes of hope, confusion, and more than once, fear. We passed through the older section, where the dates had long ago been smoothed away by decades of rain. He stopped suddenly in front of a stone whose inscription was nearly erased, only a few letters visible beneath the moss. This is where I'm supposed to be, isn't it?" he asked, but there was no answer from the earth. The longer we stood there, the stranger things felt. I watched his face in profile, saw the subtle morphing of features, a young man's jaw one moment, an old man's crow's feet the next, a shimmer of childhood innocence, and then the sudden hollowed cheeks of the elderly. It was as if the rain itself was washing him backward through his years, unraveling and reweaving his story before my eyes. The name on the stone never resolved. Each time I blinked it seemed to blur, to rearrange its letters, sometimes almost spelling out my own last name, sometimes reverting to blankness. The visitor placed his hand on the stone and shuddered. For an instant, his posture straightened, his eyes fixed on me with desperate clarity. I remember," he started, but then his gaze clouded over and he recoiled, as if burned by some realization too vast or too cruel to hold. Without another word, he turned and hurried away, his steps uneven, his youth seeming to flicker and fade as he retreated from the old grave. By the time I caught up to him at the gate, he was once again the frail old man who'd arrived that morning. His eyes were distant, his voice uncertain, his memory reset like a slate wiped clean. "Did I find who I was looking for?" he asked. I told him gently that he hadn't, and watched as he shuffled out into the rain, shoulders hunched against the world. Standing alone in the drizzle, I realized that he hadn't just almost remembered a name. He'd almost remembered himself. And for reasons neither of us could understand, that knowledge was something the cemetery, or whatever haunted its ledges and stones, would not allow. That evening, long after the visitor had vanished into the gray, I found myself unable to let go of his story. I sat alone in the cramped, dusty office, flipping through every brittle page and dog-eared logbook, searching for something to anchor the impossible. The old caretaker's diary was the last place left, a battered ledger tucked at the back of a locked drawer, the leather cover worn to softness by decades of anxious hands. It wasn't an official record, more a collection of impressions, peculiar happenings, the names and faces that stuck with a man long after he'd left the gates locked for the night. The diary was full of familiar names, some carefully crossed out, some circled and annotated in a hurried script. But one entry caught my eye, a list of recurring visitors stretching back decades. Names appeared, then were neatly struck through, with dates beside each line. Yet in the space between the names was a peculiar void, an empty line, never filled, always left blank. It appeared again and again across the decades, always in the same place, as if the caretaker expected someone whose name couldn't be written or remembered. Flipping further back, I found an old photograph glued to a yellowed page. In it, the office looked much as it did today, and standing beside the desk was the caretaker, my predecessor, a man I'd never met in life, but whose handwriting I'd come to know. And beside him, unsmiling, was the visitor. He was younger in the photo, but unmistakable. Those searching eyes, that uncertain smile. The caption beneath read only, "Monday, after the rain." No names, no date. I went to the wall where the staff photos hung, each frame labeled with the names of those who had tended the grounds before me. In the oldest photo, half faded by time, I saw the visitor again, this time a boy, standing apart from the group, eyes cast down, the only one without a label beneath his frame. I realized then that every generation of caretakers had known him, had tried to help, had failed. The following Monday, the man returned, younger than ever, perhaps no more than a child, his eyes huge and frightened. "Will you remember me?" he whispered, as I walked him to the old section, his hand trembling in mine. "Just for a while," I promised I would. He lingered by a blank stone, silent as the morning mist, before finally turning away. The next day, when I entered the office, I found a new photo slipped into the diary. A picture of me standing with a child in the rain, neither of us looking at the camera, neither of us able to recall the moment it was taken. The line for the visitor's name was blank, as always. The chair by the gate sat empty. Some stories in a graveyard have no ending, only a circling back. Some names fade from memory because they never truly belong to the living or the dead. And as I filed away the diary, I understood. My job was not to solve the mystery, nor to rewrite the records, but simply to witness. To stand at the threshold and remember, just for a while, the man who always came looking, but never found the name he'd left behind. Story 5. My name is Travis Morrow, and I've been the caretaker at Cedar Hollow Cemetery for almost 20 years. Out here, in the cold dawn before sunrise, there's a kind of silence you can only find among the stones and grass. A hush that makes every small thing seem louder, more significant. That's why I noticed them right away. It was just past 6:30 in the morning when I spotted a pair of battered old leather gloves sitting neatly atop a weathered, nameless headstone in the far west corner. The gloves were the kind my father used to wear when digging graves in the 70s. Soft, dark brown, the creases and scratches catching the blue morning light. But there was no tag, no initials, nothing to say who owned them. I figured someone from the maintenance crew or maybe one of the grave monument cleaners must have dropped them the day before. When I asked around during the morning shift change, everyone shrugged or shook their heads. Tommy, the youngest guy on our crew, swore he'd never seen them before and even made a joke about lost and found for the dead. I laughed it off. But something about the gloves unsettled me. They looked deliberate, placed, not dropped. And the grave they rested on? No name, no date, just a rough gray marker covered in moss. I'd walked past it hundreds of times and never paid attention, but now the sight of those gloves made the stone feel colder than the rest. That afternoon, after the shift, I tossed the gloves in the trash can behind the tool shed. I figured if they were important, someone would come looking for them. But the next morning, when I took my coffee out for the sunrise walk, there they were again, perched on the same nameless stone, a little cleaner than before. No dirt on the palms, no leaves stuck to the cuffs. I checked the trash. It was empty. I thought maybe someone was messing with me, playing some dumb prank, but the crew's laughter was genuine when I told them. Maybe the dead are getting handsy, one of the old-timers said. Still, it didn't feel like a joke. There was a kind of weight to those gloves, a heaviness that settled in the pit of my stomach every time I looked at them. That evening, I took them home, planning to keep them locked in my truck for a while just to see what would happen. But when I woke up the next day and headed back out to the cemetery, the gloves were waiting for me, right on top of that blank headstone, arranged just so, fingers pointing toward the sunrise. The leather was smooth, and the creases had almost disappeared, as if someone had oiled and cared for them during the night. That was the moment I stopped joking about it. No one could explain how they got there, and now my co-workers wouldn't even touch them, saying it was bad luck to meddle. I began to wonder whose grave this really was, and why those gloves, out of everything, seemed determined to come back, again and again, no matter what I did. For the first time in years, I felt watched, as if someone, or something, was waiting for me to do something with those gloves, something I hadn't figured out yet. I started sleeping less. I double-checked every gate and lock, and every morning the gloves were still there, waiting, clean and empty, on a grave that had never been claimed. I kept telling myself it was just a strange coincidence, maybe even a trick of my own tired mind. But by the third morning, the gloves were impossible to ignore, no matter what I tried, burying them under a pile of gravel in the maintenance yard, locking them in the cabinet with the herbicides, even slipping them into the glove box of my pickup and driving halfway across town. They returned every single time, always to that same unnamed grave in the cemetery's forgotten corner. Some days they were dusted with fresh earth. Other days a thin film of dew beaded on the leather as if they'd just been left outside by someone with careful hands. The guys on the crew started to avoid that part of the cemetery. Even Tommy, who liked to pretend he wasn't afraid of anything, wouldn't mow near the stone anymore. "Not my problem, boss," he said, keeping his eyes fixed on his boots. I noticed the gloves would sometimes be left lying palm up, almost expectant, like they were waiting for someone to slip their hands inside. Sometimes they would be stacked one atop the other times separated by a few inches, fingers pointing in opposite directions as if they'd been moved by a restless, invisible owner. One rainy evening, I'd had enough. I grabbed the gloves and threw them into the burn barrel behind the chapel, dousing them with lighter fluid and flicking a match. The flame sputtered and flared, and for a moment I thought I saw the gloves curl up, the fingers flexing as the leather shriveled in the heat. But when the fire died, there was nothing left, not even ash. I felt a twinge of guilt, like I'd destroyed something valuable. But the next morning, there they were, pristine, as if reborn, waiting patiently on the same grave. This time, the leather looked newer, almost glossy, and I could swear there was a faint scent of fresh-turned earth in the air. Now the gloves started appearing not just in the morning, but at odd hours. Sometimes after I finished digging a grave, sometimes at dusk just before I locked up for the night. They'd always be clean after an interment, sometimes even dusted off with the back of someone's sleeve, and I began to notice a pattern. Every time a new grave was scheduled, the gloves would be there, sitting atop the mound of soil that would soon be someone's final bed. They arrived before the coffin, before the mourners, before even I had marked the spot. I'd try to ignore them, but it became harder with every day that passed. They never got dirty, never wore out, never aged like the rest of my equipment. If I left them alone, I'd find them waiting on my shovel or tucked neatly inside my locker. A silent reminder that some jobs, some obligations couldn't be escaped, no matter how hard you tried. It felt less like I was being haunted and more like I was being watched, measured, and slowly, without realizing it, claimed. My hands started to itch when I worked without gloves. My fingers ached on cold mornings, and sometimes I caught myself reaching for the leather pair as if they belonged to me, as if they'd always been mine. It was one of those nights when the cemetery air sits heavy and unmoving, thick with a dampness that soaks straight through your bones. I was making my final round, lantern in hand, when I saw them. The gloves, perched on top of the nameless stone, fingers splayed as if stretching after a long rest. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the way the shadows played across the uneven ground. But as I stepped closer, I saw movement, unmistakable, deliberate. One finger curled in toward the palm, then another, slow and careful, as if the gloves were waking up from some deep sleep. The rest followed, knuckles flexing until the whole pair clenched tight, then relaxed again, empty but not lifeless. My scalp prickled and my heart hammered as I watched, unable to move, unable to call out. In that moment, every story I'd ever heard about haunted tools and restless spirits seemed painfully, vividly real. I dropped my lantern and it clattered against the gravel, the flame sputtering but holding on. In the faint circle of its light, the gloves paused, just for a breath, then resumed their slow, uncanny dance, twisting to one side, fingers drumming softly against the marble as if impatient. It didn't stop there. Over the following nights, I caught glimpses of the gloves in the corners of my vision, sometimes lying motionless, sometimes shifting just enough to suggest purpose. One evening I found them halfway up a gravestone, fingers spread wide, almost as if they were writing something in the fine dust that settled there. In the morning, the marks were gone, swept away by the wind or maybe by the gloves themselves. Word spread among the groundskeepers. A few swore they'd seen the gloves crawling through the grass, inching from one stone to the next like the hands of a clock, marking time no living person kept. On a night when the fog rolled in thick and white, I saw both gloves standing upright, index fingers pointed toward the sky as if signaling some silent agreement. That night, a new grave had been dug, a job I did not remember doing, a hole I never recalled starting. I started leaving the gloves alone, refusing to touch or move them, but it didn't matter. They showed up everywhere, on the handles of my tools, clinging to the gate, or balanced on the rim of the wheelbarrow before I set out for the day. Each time, they bore a little more dirt, the scent of damp clay clinging to them like an accusation. I'd find small tracks in the fresh-turned soil, marks too delicate and narrow to belong to any animal, always in pairs, always leading away from or toward the newest grave. What truly broke my resolve was the night I watched them move across the floor of the chapel, fingers skittering, palms flat, tracing patterns in the dust as though spelling out a message I couldn't read. I shivered and turned away, pretending I hadn't seen it. But from then on, every time I closed my eyes, I saw leather fingers twitching, waiting for a pair of hands to claim them for good. After that night, with the gloves writing in chapel dust, my relationship with sleep became uneasy, fractured into strange fragments and waking terrors. I'd go to bed exhausted, too tired to think, only to jolt awake before dawn, sheets twisted, heart racing, with the echo of dirt being shoveled ringing in my ears. Most times I'd chalk it up to nerves and the weight of so many oddities piling up. But then the mornings changed. I began finding freshly dug graves, plots I hadn't scheduled, holes perfect in depth and shape, the earth mounded up beside them as if I'd finished the job minutes before and simply walked away, tools nowhere to be found. The first time it happened, I blamed another worker, though I knew I'd been alone the whole previous shift. The next time, I scoured the ground for signs of machinery, footprints, anything that could explain how a grave had been prepared without my knowledge. There was nothing. No marks, but the faintest impressions of something small pressing into the soil, like a hand or, impossibly, gloved fingers. Each time, the gloves were there waiting for me, resting neatly atop the mound, sometimes spotless, sometimes smudged with earth as if they'd been hard at work. Word got around, whispers in the break room about ghost shifts and the tools that moved on their own. Nobody wanted to take the night shift anymore, and a few started calling in sick whenever a new grave was needed. But the schedule pressed on, and so did the graves, appearing with a regularity that made me question the border between memory and dream. I'd ask myself, did I dig that one last night? Or did I only dream it? Was I losing time? Or was something else working while I slept? On nights when I managed to catch a few hours rest, my dreams were vivid and disturbing. I'd see the cemetery stretching out before me, row on row of graves, and in every vision, the gloves appeared. Sometimes at my side, sometimes at the end of a shovel, sometimes writhing alone in the dirt. I watched myself digging, but my hands weren't my own. The gloves covered them, snug and seamless, guiding my motions with a confidence that felt utterly foreign. I'd awaken with the feel of leather pressed tight around my fingers, and sometimes my palms tingled with a faint, unnatural numbness. Things escalated. One morning, I woke with dirt beneath my fingernails, the taste of earth dry and bitter at the back of my throat. The gloves waited on the porch, clean and expectant, as though they knew I'd come for them. That day, every shovel I lifted felt heavier than usual, as if some part of me resisted doing the work. But the graves kept appearing, flawless and ready. The earth always turned with the neatness of a practiced hand. The gloves never left my sight for long. Sometimes I found them gripping the handle of my own shovel, as though inviting me to pick up where I'd left off, or where they'd left off for me. I began to sense a strange gratitude in the way the gloves returned, always just in time for a new burial, always in the right place. It was as if they were thanking me for letting them work, for not resisting too much, for accepting their presence. The lines between my labor and theirs, my intentions and their mysterious will, blurred until I wondered if I was digging at all, or if I'd become at last just another tool, guided by a force older and more patient than any man. By the end of that autumn, the cemetery seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't describe, a strange anticipation that clung to the mist and shivered through the grass. Each morning, the gloves appeared somewhere new, perched on the wrought iron fence, draped over the handle of the wheelbarrow, or resting neatly on the seat of my battered pickup. It became ritual to find them, and, in a moment of reluctant respect, return them to the chapel or the old storage locker. No matter how many times I tried to lock them away or bury them beneath layers of rags, they always came back. Their leather now bore scars and fresh stains, as if they'd been places I had never been and done things I could never admit to doing. But it was the 7th morning in November that changed everything. I woke up before dawn, cold to the bone, with a sensation like pins and needles running from my elbows to the tips of my fingers. As I walked out to the grounds, I noticed an unusual hush, not the silence of dawn, but a suspended quiet, like the world holding its breath. I made my rounds, every step slower than the last, my hands oddly clumsy and my breath clouding thick in the air. That was when I saw them. The gloves weren't scattered this time. They were arranged with intent, placed side by side atop a single grave that hadn't existed the day before. My name was carved, clear and precise, into the stone. The dates were blank, as if the story hadn't finished yet. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned, unable to look away from those two shapes so patient in the morning light. I tried to back away, but my hands tingled again. An emptiness, a longing for something missing. It dawned on me in a cold rush that my own hands were bare, my skin as pale as the marble beneath my name, my knuckles aching with a memory I couldn't place. I knelt beside the grave, compelled, and reached out to touch the gloves. As my fingertips brushed the leather, a current ran up my arm, sharp, electric, yet somehow gentle. The gloves flexed as if greeting an old friend, their fingers curling around mine in a gesture that felt both alien and inevitable. Images flooded my mind. Graves dug through decades, countless shovels lifted, silent witnesses in the moonlight, and always these gloves present. Not tools, but companions, watching over the work that had to be done. A flash of memory, another man years ago, standing just where I knelt now, his hands slipping off the gloves for the last time and leaving them for the next to wear. I realized then what I should have known all along. These gloves didn't belong to anyone. They belonged to the cemetery itself, to the endless cycle of earth turned and names forgotten, waiting for the hands of each new caretaker. Maybe I had always been destined to find them, just as surely as I was destined to become a part of this place, another link in the quiet chain of labor stretching back generations. As I slid my hands inside, a warmth bloomed in my chest. The gloves fit perfectly, as if they'd been made just for me. The emptiness faded, replaced by a calm acceptance, and for the first time in months, the tingling in my hands stopped. The morning breeze picked up, stirring the trees, and the silence broke. A bird called from the fence, the world continued, and I stood, gloves snug and certain. There was work to do. There would always be work to do. And now I understood. Sometimes, in a place like this, you don't choose the gloves. The gloves choose you. Story 6. There's a room at the back of the old chapel, tucked beneath the broken bell tower, where boxes gather more dust than memories. I'd been working as the cemetery caretaker in southern Illinois for most of my adult life, long enough that the stories blend together and the faces of the dead outnumber the living. That Monday morning, chasing a draft in the hallway, I found myself cleaning out a cabinet no one had opened in decades. The hinges groaned like a warning, but all I saw inside was a heap of moth-eaten hymnals, 3 melted candles, and a book that shouldn't have been there. A black notebook thick with age and the smell of mold. I brushed it off, sneezed, and felt an odd chill crawl up my wrist as I cracked the cover. No title, just a single line scrawled across the inside cover in red ink. Debts paid, debts remain. At first I thought it was a ledger for church donations, but each entry was stranger than the last. Names, hundreds of them, written in dozens of different hands. Some old, faded nearly to invisibility, others so fresh, I swear the ink was still wet. Every name was followed by a date, a short phrase, and, in some cases, numbers. Martha Elkins, May 3rd, 1962. Promised bread, never delivered. 025. Arthur Wells, July 19th, 1987. Took what wasn't his, never returned. No value. Sometimes there were just words. Lied. Left. Abandoned. Forgot. What sent a chill down my spine wasn't the list itself. It was that maybe a third of the names had been struck through in an angry slash of red ink. Some entries I recognized. Old folks from when I was a kid. The butcher's wife. A school teacher who vanished one spring. Most of the names, though, were a mystery. There were dates from the 19th century, scrawled in archaic cursive, and a few so recent they hadn't had time to yellow. Some pages had tally marks in the margins. 5, 7, 13, as if someone was keeping score. I read until my head ached, then stuffed the book back in the drawer and told myself it was just another relic, a leftover from a pastor with a long memory and a petty streak. But the longer I tried to forget it, the more the thing stuck in my mind like a splinter under a nail. That night, I dreamed of the book. I saw it open on my kitchen table, pages riffling in a wind I couldn't feel. Every time I blinked, The entries changed. Names I knew were added and erased. My own mother's name, my father's, even mine, though I couldn't read what was written next to it. I woke up with a metallic taste in my mouth, a certainty that the notebook wanted to be found, and a fear that it was more than just a list of debts. When dawn crept through the blinds, I went back to the chapel. The notebook was right where I'd left it, but I could swear it was heavier, almost humming with some quiet, impossible pressure, like the weight of a storm you sense in your bones before it breaks. That was when I noticed the drawer it had sat in was lined with earth, not dust. Real, loose soil, black as midnight and still damp, as if it had been dug up that morning. The day after I found the notebook, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in the air, like when the sky turns yellow before a tornado, but quieter, more insidious. I'd left the caderno, that's what the oldest folks called any strange old book in our town, back in the chapel, but the weight of it followed me everywhere. I kept thinking about those names, especially the ones with the angry red line through them. I started to wonder if anyone else in town might remember some of the people listed, if maybe there was an old grudge or an unpaid debt that lingered longer than flesh. So that afternoon, I walked down Main Street and stopped at the bakery. Mrs. Carmichael has worked there since my childhood, and she's the unofficial town historian. I asked if she remembered Martha Elkins or Arthur Wells. She gave me a blank look, then a shake of the head that felt rehearsed. "Never heard of them," she said. "But those sound like old names, honey. You sure you didn't read them in some newspaper clipping?" I left with stale bread and more questions than answers. The library was next. Old yearbooks, town census records, obituaries. I found nothing for Martha, nothing for Arthur. It was as if those people never existed, at least not here. But that night, as I walked the rows of the cemetery, checking for stray branches after a windstorm, I noticed a new grave. A plot I'd mowed just 2 days ago now had fresh-turned earth and a blank wooden marker. No inscription, no flowers, no record in the burial ledger, which I checked twice with trembling hands. And yet, in the morning light, there it was, a perfectly rectangular patch of earth, as if someone had dug and filled it overnight. I thought maybe it was a mistake, a prank, or a job someone had forgotten to log. But when I returned to the chapel and opened the caderno, I saw that a name, one I didn't recognize, had been crossed out in red. A date was added beside it. Last night. By the end of that week, it happened twice more. Each time, a name disappeared from the notebook and a new grave appeared somewhere in the oldest part of the cemetery. I asked around town about the new burials, but no one remembered a funeral or even noticed the fresh mounds. The mortician, Mr. Harlan, shrugged it off, said maybe I was working too hard, seeing things that weren't there. But every time I checked the caderno, another name was gone, another line slashed in red, and another plot appeared, always without a marker, always with soil too loose and dark to be natural. It took me longer than I care to admit to realize that the caderno wasn't just a record, it was a ledger, and it was being balanced in real time. I started to dread each nightfall, afraid of what the morning would bring. The list in the book seemed to shrink a little every day, but the cemetery kept growing, one silent, unmarked grave at a time. And for the first time in my years among the dead, I wondered what would happen when the names ran out, if the debts were ever really paid, or if the cementerio was simply hungrier than I'd realized. Over the following days, I became obsessed with the ledger's strange logic. At first, I thought it was a book of old, unpaid bills, maybe debts for funeral services or headstones. But as I read deeper into each cramped line, I realized these entries weren't always about money. Some names had dollar amounts, but most were just phrases, memories, secrets, promises, confessions that had nothing to do with cash. A promise never kept, 1963. A lie told to a mother, 1978. A door locked forever, winter of 1955. There were entries with no sum at all, only guilt. A letter never sent. A key hidden in a drawer. A favor refused to the dying. The more I studied, the more the book haunted me. I checked burial records and realized many of the debts that had been crossed out belonged to people who'd been dead for decades, people whose graves I'd cleaned countless times, men and women gone quietly, with nothing in their public story that matched what was written in the ledger. But the book remembered. The red slashes through their names felt final, almost cruel. What truly unnerved me was how new names appeared every day. Living people from town I saw every week. A woman who had never forgiven her brother for a childhood slight. A man who'd borrowed a tool and never returned it. The ledger wrote these tiny betrayals down as debts, as coldly as it wrote amounts of money. I watched as names were crossed out overnight, and the next day, their houses sat dark and empty, mailboxes overflowing, their faces missing from church or the diner. Nobody in town spoke of it. People simply vanished, and the world carried on. Only a new grave, unmarked or hastily carved, appeared in the oldest rows. The dirt was always freshly turned. I tried to destroy the book, burned a page, shredded another. The next night, I'd find it perfectly restored, as if nothing had been touched. I told myself this was someone's sick joke, some long-dead priest's way of haunting his flock, but the pattern was too relentless. The book knew every debt, large or small, and it collected, quietly, relentlessly. Some nights I'd find the ledger open on my desk, even though I was sure I'd locked it away. New debts appeared without my hand. One line read, "A promise made at the edge of a grave, never fulfilled." It was only then I began to understand that this cemetery wasn't just a resting place for the dead. It was a vault for unfinished business, and the ledger was its keeper. Every secret, every lie, every broken promise was remembered and brought to account, one way or another. It became clear to me, no one here was ever truly free until every debt, spoken or silent, was finally paid. It was well past midnight when I found myself in the office, unable to sleep, drawn once again to the black ledger resting on my desk. Its presence was heavier now, an unspoken tension in the room, as if the book itself was breathing in the shadows. I meant only to lock it away for good, but when I reached for it, the pages fell open on their own, fluttering to the last page, and I froze at what I saw. There, written in that strange, unmistakable hand, was my name. No dollar amount, no date, just my name, and beside it, a single entry. A debt forgotten by the debtor. The ink was still wet. I traced the line with my finger, half convinced I could smudge it away, but it would not blur or fade. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, some joke played by a coworker. But deep down, I remembered things I'd pushed away. A favor I'd never returned. A promise to an old friend I'd broken years before taking this job. My heart pounded with a sense of exposure, as if the cemetery itself had reached up and tapped me on the shoulder. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning until the first hint of dawn. When I finally wandered outside, drawn by a sick sense of curiosity and dread, I saw a patch of earth by the northern fence that looked disturbed, fresh, loose, and darker than the rest. I approached and saw the outline of a new grave, the kind we dig for someone without a family. There was no marker yet, but I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it had something to do with me. I pressed my hand to the earth, feeling its coldness soak through my palm. The ground seemed to pulse beneath my fingers, as if waiting for me to acknowledge its claim. Inside the chapel, I tried to rip out the page with my name, desperate to erase it, to buy myself time. But as before, the paper knit itself back together as soon as I looked away. I burned the entire book in a fit of panic, standing over the barrel as the flames rose. But the next morning, the ledger sat unharmed on my desk, its cover cool to the touch. All day, a chill followed me, and wherever I went, I felt eyes on me. Not the living, but a silent audience from under the soil. The rest of the week blurred together. My appetite faded, sleep came only in short, feverish snatches, and every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of red ink flowing from the earth, spelling my name over and over until it filled the world. By Sunday, the fresh grave by the northern fence had a small, unmarked stone at its head. I tried not to look at it, but when I finally gathered the courage to approach, I saw my own reflection in the polished surface, eyes hollow, face pale, mouth half open in a silent confession. The ledger, I realized, didn't care about reasons, only results. My debt was waiting to be paid, and the cemetery, patient as ever, would see that every account eventually was settled. After my name appeared in the ledger, something changed in the air around the cemetery, a pressure, a watching presence that settled in my bones. I started noticing movement at the edge of my vision, shadows slipping between headstones, and a strange chill that clung to my skin, even in the late summer sun. Every night, as I made my rounds, a figure seemed to drift between the rows, cloaked and faceless, its steps soundless on gravel and grass. At first, I thought I was simply exhausted, the fear getting to my mind, but the feeling of being followed only grew stronger with each passing day. The town itself seemed to know. People in the bakery lowered their voices when I entered, glancing at me as if they'd heard some whisper about what happens when your name shows up in the old cemetery's black book. A neighbor I'd known for years avoided my eyes, muttering about debts that come due. And each morning, the cold patch near the northern fence seemed to expand, swallowing the grass and creeping closer to the path I walked every dawn. One night, after another failed attempt to destroy the ledger, it reappeared, unburnt, with my name inked darker than before. I saw the cloaked figure standing motionless under the old oak near the chapel. No moon, no wind, just that absolute stillness as it turned, not with a face, but with the weight of awareness. In its gloved hand, it held the black ledger, open to the last page. I didn't run. There was nowhere to go that the cemetery's boundaries wouldn't follow. Instead, I found myself drawn forward, legs heavy as lead, until I stood only a few feet from the figure. I expected cold, a stench of rot or decay, but there was only a crisp, iron scent. Old blood, old ink, old promises unkept. The figure raised a finger, silent, and pointed at the earth at my feet. I felt a numbness spread up my legs, rooting me in place. I knew without words that it wasn't here for vengeance or mercy. It was here for the tally, for the exacting of debts owed by the living and the dead alike. The ledger flipped shut with a sound that seemed to echo through my teeth, and in that moment, memories flooded back. Favors I'd forgotten, small betrayals, careless words spoken long ago. They spun through my mind like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. When I blinked, the figure was gone, but the cold remained. I staggered back to the chapel and saw, through the frosted window, the black ledger sitting where I'd left it. Page open, my name now underlined twice in red. I closed the book, hands trembling, and the wind outside rose to a low moan, the kind that rattles the panes and tugs at old regrets. I understood then that the collector was not a ghost or a demon, but the last faithful custodian of the cemetery, a warden who never left, who waited through centuries for every debt to be paid in full. The city could pave new streets, and names could fade from stone, but the ledger would remain, recording every deal, every broken promise, every soul owing a final due. And so I wait, too, watching, keeping record, walking the paths each dawn with the cold at my back, knowing the collector still circles the rows, ledger in hand, until my debt is settled and another name takes my place in the book that never runs out of pages. Story 7. It started the morning after the worst storm our town had seen in years. One of those restless Midwest nights when the wind roars and the rain feels like it'll strip the paint from your bones. I'd barely slept, so by dawn I was already out, checking the cemetery for fallen branches and broken stones. That's when I saw it. In the oldest part of the graveyard, on a crooked wooden cross that marked no one in particular, there hung a single muddy child's shoe. Not tossed or lost, but placed, deliberate, toe pointing skyward, laces tied into a perfect bow caked with grit. I knelt down, expecting maybe some prank, or the wind to have carried it from the street, but it was dry beneath, not washed by rain. The cross itself was bone dry too, though everything else was sodden. I picked up the shoe, turned it over in my palm, and realized the leather was old, cracked at the seams. But it didn't belong to any child I could think of, not in a town this size, not with shoes like these, stitched by hand, toes scuffed by generations. I set it back, feeling odd about moving it. Maybe it was some strange memorial, I told myself. I made my rounds, fixing a fence here, tossing branches there. But by noon, I started finding more shoes. Another, this time a battered women's pump with a broken heel, perched atop the granite corner of a family plot. Later, an ankle boot, split at the side, dangling from a wrought iron gate. Always one at a time, always where they couldn't have been left by accident, high up or tied to something or set just so. All muddy, all still wet. I started to keep a tally in my notebook, thinking it might be some neighborhood joke, or maybe a kid acting out. But the shoes were all odd. No pairs, just lonely, mismatched, none the same color or era. The styles ranged from antique button-ups to rubber galoshes and dress loafers. Some so old they looked like museum pieces, soles worn paper-thin. By sundown, I'd counted 11 shoes. Never an even number, never a single matching pair. It began to feel less like a prank and more like a message, though I couldn't tell what for. I checked the gates, locked, as they should be. No sign of tracks in the wet grass, no footprints or drag marks in the dirt. Only the shoes, always muddy, always out of place. That night, I sat on my porch, looking out over the dark graveyard as thunder rumbled far off and the air still tasted like rain. I told myself it would all make sense in the morning, that someone would come to collect the shoes, or at least explain. But in my gut, I already knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop with a single storm, or with a single shoe. And deep down, a part of me started to wonder if the shoes had come here for someone, and if so, who? The next morning, I walked the rows again, determined to find some connection. By then, more shoes had appeared. This time a battered men's brogue, a girl's patent leather Mary Jane with a snapped strap, a heavy boot with its laces missing and the tongue askew. I tried to reason it out. Maybe the storm had carried them here, swept in by floodwater. But there was no sign of water pooling in the graveyard. And anyway, the shoes always landed in impossible places, balanced on the highest crosses, hung from iron fences, tucked into the arms of angel statues. Not scattered by accident, chosen. By mid-morning, I noticed something stranger. Each shoe was found near a grave with a blank or worn headstone, or else no marker at all. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but as I mapped out the locations, the pattern became too precise. The oldest section of the cemetery, the corner we called Potter's Field, held most of the shoes. Those graves had always troubled me, plots given to the poor, the lost, the unnamed. Sometimes just a number or nothing at all. No visitors, no flowers, no one left alive to mourn. Some stones had eroded into shapeless nubs, the names ground away by a century of rain. I went back to the office and started pulling town records, searching for names or families linked to those unmarked graves. Most of the files were useless, missing, water damaged, or never created in the first place. Some entries were just question marks, a dash, or unknown. As I dug deeper, I realized many of these graves were from times of crisis, an influenza wave, a fire at the mill, some even from when the town was nothing more than a stop on the railroad. Unclaimed bodies, buried in haste, their stories lost. I took a walk back out, boots crunching on wet gravel. For the first time, I tried to picture the shoes not as left-behind objects, but as tokens, reminders of people who never had a proper marker or a family to visit. The shoes stood in for names that never made it onto stone. Every muddy pair seemed to whisper, "Remember me? Even if you never knew who I was." A chill prickled the back of my neck as I realized there were more shoes than usual today, all clustered around the oldest, nameless plots. I wondered if the storm had brought something besides wind and rain, something that stirred up old debts, or called back memories the town was too small or too tired to hold. That afternoon, as I locked up, I glanced back one last time at the rows of blank stones and felt the weight of hundreds of missing names pressing in around me. I told myself it was just weather, just bad luck, just another small-town oddity. But that night, I dreamed of empty graves, muddy footprints, and shoes walking by themselves through the mist, searching for a name to call their own. That night I barely slept, unsettled by dreams of wandering, faceless figures traipsing through the headstones in search of something lost. At dawn, I was back in the cemetery before the sun had dried the dew from the grass. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and the sky a sharp, cloudless blue. But the shoes were still there. If anything, their numbers had grown. Some were damp with morning moisture, others dusted with fresh earth, as if they had only just been set down. I moved carefully, unwilling to disturb them, scanning for any sign that someone had come during the night. What I found instead were footprints, Small, perfect impressions, pressed into the soft soil at the base of several nameless graves. Some were the tiny ovals of a child, others long and narrow, or heavy and deep like a grown man's boots. The footprints snaked from grave to grave, sometimes stopping at a cross or pausing by a newly appeared shoe, then continuing on as if in procession. I followed one trail as it meandered between stones, looped around the oldest angel, and ended at the foot of a headstone so worn the name had become a memory even the granite couldn't hold. I crouched to inspect the prints more closely. No one else had been in the cemetery overnight, and certainly not barefoot. There were no scuff marks, no cigarette butts, no candy wrappers or beer cans. The only disturbance was a fine, sticky mud, still wet even though the rest of the ground had begun to harden under the sun. Some of the footprints were so faint they might have vanished with the next breeze. I thought about how often I'd swept the paths, how many years I'd raked leaves or shoveled snow without ever noticing anything out of the ordinary in that section. The realization crept over me slowly. These weren't the footprints of the living. As I stood, a cold wind moved through the stones, and I swore I heard a rustle, not of leaves, but of fabric dragging through grass. For a moment, I half expected to see someone standing among the shoes, reaching out for a pair that fit. But the cemetery was empty. Just the rows of nameless graves, the scattered odd shoes, and the sun rising higher over everything lost. All morning I watched from my office window, waiting for some explanation. A prankster, a wandering animal, even a desperate family member seeking closure for a forgotten loved one. No one came. No one ever did, except for me. By afternoon, I checked the stone paths one last time and found them dotted with patches of fresh, wet earth, like muddy footprints pausing for a moment before fading away into the grass. The shoes, the nameless graves, the unseen visitors, it all seemed to form a pattern, one that was closing in step by step from the edges of memory to the present. I told myself there had to be an explanation, but deep down, I knew this was a kind of accounting. The cemetery was doing all on its own, a tally of the unnamed, the unclaimed, the ones who might only be remembered by the faint, wet prints they left behind. That evening, I waited until long after dusk before making my rounds. The cemetery felt even larger under the thick, silvery fog that rolled in from the river, every sound muffled except the soft drip of water from trees and the distant hum of a late train. I carried a flashlight and moved carefully along the gravel paths, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. All day I had been haunted by the memory of those footprints, prints that couldn't belong to any living visitor, prints that seemed to multiply with the shoes. I wondered what I might find if I looked for their end. When I reached the oldest section of the graveyard, where the moss nearly covered the stones and even the names seemed to have been erased by time, my light caught something unusual at the base of one of the nameless graves. There, side by side and perfectly aligned, stood a pair of shoes I had never seen before. They were men's leather Oxfords, old-fashioned but unscuffed, as if they had just come from the cobbler's shop a century ago. Mud clung to the soles and a single dry leaf was stuck to one of the laces. Without really thinking, I bent down and picked them up. The shoes felt cool, almost shockingly so, as if they had been left in a cellar overnight. I was startled by their size. They matched my feet exactly, not just the length or width, but the way the insides seemed to cradle the arch and heel, as if they had been shaped around my own steps. On impulse, or maybe out of a need to understand, I slipped my feet into them. The fit was perfect. Not merely comfortable, but unsettlingly right, as though these shoes had been waiting for me for years. I stood in silence, the world suddenly sharper, more vivid, the cemetery both familiar and newly strange. I heard a faint sucking noise, as if something below the earth had exhaled and drawn in air at the same time. I took a step back, then another, and the shoes carried me surely over the grass, past rows of nameless graves, toward the cemetery gate. As I crossed the threshold onto the street, the fog seemed to part for me. It wasn't until I reached my own front porch that I noticed the trail I'd left behind. Muddy footprints, the exact shape and tread of the shoes now on my feet, running all the way from the cemetery gate to my door. Inside my house, the shoes felt impossible to remove, as if the leather had tightened around my feet, the laces binding me to something old and unfinished. I tried to ignore the strange chill that seeped up from the soles, but all night, I dreamed of walking among graves, searching for something I could never quite find. In every dream, I heard a chorus of footsteps behind me, some slow, some hurried, all closing in. When I awoke, there was dirt under my fingernails and the faint, damp smell of the cemetery in my room, and the shoes, polished and waiting, stood by my bed, ready for another walk. The next morning I was determined to put an end to whatever spell the shoes and their silent owners had cast over my life. I sat on the edge of my bed, feet still encased in the leather, and forced myself to untie the laces, ignoring how cold and stiff my hands felt. The shoes slipped off easily, as if finally yielding to my will, and for a fleeting moment I thought the worst had passed. I carried them back to the cemetery in a plastic bag, passing the familiar path marked by my own dried, muddy prints. The shoes felt heavier with every step, as if they absorbed the weight of 100 stories each time I crossed the graveyard gate. At the oldest cross, I dropped the shoes and turned away, not looking back as I locked the cemetery behind me for the day. But that night, before sleep could claim me, something made me glance out the window toward the distant gates. I could see, illuminated by the waning moon, the unmistakable silhouettes of those same shoes, now resting neatly on a different grave, this time hanging by their laces, swaying ever so slightly in a wind I couldn't feel. Each day after, I tried to rid myself of the shoes with increasing desperation. I burned them in a steel barrel behind the chapel, only to find them untouched and gleaming by my office door at dawn. I buried them beneath a headstone, but they reappeared, dusted clean, and perched atop the next nameless grave. I left them at the city dump, but a neighbor brought them back, saying she'd found them sitting at the cemetery gate, as if waiting to be let in. Every failed attempt left me feeling more exhausted, more tangled in the silent language of the graveyard. Soon, it wasn't just one pair anymore. Every morning, more shoes arrived. Children's boots, women's slippers, heavy workmen's shoes, all arranged with unsettling care on the crosses and unmarked stones. Some were soaked with fresh mud, others glimmered as if brand new, but every single one felt somehow claimed. The townspeople stopped visiting. The paths grew empty. The cemetery belonged to the shoes and their missing owners. Then one dawn, as fog crept low between the headstones, I realized my own name was fading from my mailbox, the paint growing thinner each day. That night, my reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to waver, as though I too was being rubbed out, becoming only a pair of footprints leading from my door to the graveyard. When I returned at sunrise, I saw the final proof, a nameless grave in the oldest section, a fresh pair of shoes waiting atop it, mine, newly polished, impossibly clean, and a perfect fit for no one living. It hit me with the certainty of a tolling bell. The cemetery never forgot those who remained unclaimed, and it never stopped waiting for the last pair. My steps, marked and mapped, would soon belong to that silent collection. My shoes the newest offering to a place where the lost and the forgotten waited for someone else to fill their place, and the footprints of the living eventually led only one way, straight to the earth. Story 8. I've worked this cemetery in Michigan for 32 years, and I thought I knew every secret stone and silent ritual of this place. But nothing ever unsettled me like the old wall clock hanging above the Eastern Mausoleum's bronze door. For as long as anyone could remember, the clock was more of a relic than a timepiece. Its yellowed face smudged with dust, its hands forever paused at some random hour that never matched the world outside. Nobody cared. Nobody needed a clock among the dead. At least, not until the night I saw it move. It was early spring, one of those weeks when the fog rolls in before sunset and clings to the ground like a memory. I'd been closing up the tool shed when I thought I heard ticking echoing out from the mausoleum. It was a real ticking too, steady, alive, cutting through the quiet. I unlocked the gate and stepped inside, flashlight sweeping past the old crypts. The air was cold, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones. I looked up at the clock. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the hands were moving, slow, smooth, and unmistakably backward. The second hand glided counterclockwise, and as it did, the minute hand jerked in tiny, stubborn spasms, like it was being forced back through its own history. I stood and watched, unable to look away as the clock unwound. I glanced at my own watch. 2:39 a.m. The cemetery was silent as ever outside, but in that mausoleum, The past was bleeding out from the tick of that clock. The hands slowed as they approached 3 o'clock, then jerked suddenly to a stop. At exactly 3:14, a time that meant nothing to me. Nothing. Until I checked the cemetery records the next morning and found that 3:14 was the official time of death for one Franklin McCoy, a well-known businessman who died in a fire 50 years ago and was entombed in that very building. The next night, I came back to see if it would happen again. I sat on the cracked stone bench, the cold numbing my hands, waiting for the clock to start its midnight ritual. Sure enough, a little before 3, it started spinning backward again, slowly at first, then faster, unwinding hours like they were just threads to be pulled. This time, the hand stopped at 2:47. The name didn't mean anything until, out of curiosity, I checked the logbooks and saw that 2:47 was the time of death for Martha Holloway, the first child ever buried in the Eastern Plot back in 1913. That's how it started. The clock never moved during the day. It was a dead object, no batteries, no winding, no mechanism that should have worked. But at night, it pulled the hours in reverse, always settling on a time that belonged to the dead. After a week of this, I stopped pretending it was just a strange coincidence or some mechanical quirk. I started to feel like I was watching a ritual, a piece of the cemetery's hidden machinery, counting backwards not to tell the living what time it was, but to remind the dead, and maybe me, that out here, time isn't about the present at all. It's about everything that refuses to stay buried. The second week, I started keeping a journal, writing down every time the clock spun backward, and which name in the old ledgers matched the hour. At first, it felt like a game for my own sanity, a way to prove I wasn't just tired or losing my mind to loneliness and shadow. But by Wednesday, the cemetery itself began to respond, and I realized I was witnessing something much deeper. The hours the clock turned seemed to drag pieces of the past into the present, distorting the boundary between memory and reality. On those nights, I'd walk the grounds after the mausoleum's ritual, lantern in hand, and the eastern plots always felt different. The fog was thicker, rolling lower. Sometimes the dirt atop certain graves looked freshly turned, as if someone or something had just been there. A couple times the names on some old stones were faded by morning, as if the night air had erased them. Other mornings, I'd find bouquets, wilted and colorless, on top of graves whose visitors had died decades ago. The strangest were the sounds. I first heard it at 3:14 a.m., right as the clock finished its backward dance. A faint murmur, like a crowd gathering just out of sight. Then, the clop of horse hooves on stone, the rustle of heavy clothes, the soft shush of footsteps in grass, all swirling around the mausoleum and the eastern corridor. More than once, I heard the distinct creak of the cemetery's old funeral wagon, a thing that hadn't been used in 50 years. I thought maybe kids were sneaking in, but no one ever appeared on the cameras. The only faces I saw, wandering between the headstones, were ones I recognized from black and white photographs in the records room. The long-gone pastor, the grieving parents, the young widow with her hair in ribbons, all of them repeating the same movements I'd seen in yellowed pictures, looping through rituals of burial and mourning, vanishing just before dawn. One morning, I found muddy footprints leading up to the oldest crypt. They circled, then stopped, as if someone had been waiting. I pressed my hand to the door and it felt colder than stone, almost electric, like touching a wire in winter. That day, the nameplate on that crypt was missing, just gone, leaving a shadow in the shape of letters no one would read again. It became clear that the clock was not just a marker of forgotten hours. It was a lever, prying open the ground between past and present. Each time it spun backwards, something old was let loose. A memory, a ritual, a presence. And every hour it stopped at was another story the cemetery refused to let go, another secret exhumed from the shallow grave of time. By then, I had stopped asking who, or what, was winding the clock. I only wondered how long it would be before it started winding me backward too. It was a Friday night, thunder rolling distant, when the clock in the East Mausoleum began its slow, deliberate spin backward, each click echoing in the hollow corridors. I stood by the door, flashlight in hand, unable to look away. This time, the hand stopped at 11:37 p.m., the very hour, according to the brittle records in my desk drawer, when Albert Jameson, the caretaker before me, had died of a heart attack while tending the crypts in 1962. But when the cold settled in and the mist poured over the threshold, what I saw outside wasn't the world I'd known. It was the cemetery as it must have looked 6 decades ago. Gravestones less weathered, marble still sharp-edged, and iron gates newly painted. Gas lanterns flickered instead of security lights. And from the shadows near the willow tree, a small funeral procession moved silently, the mourners' faces half remembered from sepia photographs on the office wall. I watched as they carried a casket, Jameson's casket, toward the family plot, the rain dampening their dark coats and veils. I recognized his widow, her eyes red and fixed on the ground, and the town's old priest, whose voice I'd only ever read in eulogies written in a shaky hand. But the strangest thing was seeing myself, or the man I had become, standing off to the side, hands folded, hat removed in respect. He looked up, his face flickering between the past and my own reflection. Our eyes met for an instant, so sharp it cut through the storm. The funeral played out, as if on an old film reel, grainy and silent. Each mourner placed a white rose atop the casket before turning away. The priest spoke words I couldn't hear, but I could feel them, heavy, final, as though they were sealing more than a coffin. The sky split with lightning, illuminating the entire scene in a wash of blue-white light, and in that flash, every name on the surrounding stones sharpened, then began to blur and fade, erased as the past bled into the present. The clock in the mausoleum ticked once more, breaking the spell, and the night snapped back to its usual, lonely silence. But when I checked the logbook the next morning, a new entry appeared in handwriting I recognized as my own. Attended funeral, November 1962. Weather, rain. Eulogy, brief. Witnesses, too many to count. My hands shook as I traced the lines. I'd written it, but I had no memory of doing so. And outside, near Jameson's grave, fresh rose petals lay scattered on the newly dampened earth. Roses no florist in town had sold for decades. The clock, as always, stood still until the next night, ready to turn time backwards once again. And I understood, with an ache in my bones, that some secrets in this place didn't stay buried. Sometimes, they just waited for the right hour to return. After witnessing the impossible procession that seemed to fold the years over themselves, I became obsessed with the East Mausoleum's clock and its silent authority over the cemetery's memory. Each night, as the clock's hands ticked backwards, I would prowl the grounds with my notebook, desperate to catch every subtle change, every shift in the names and dates on the stones. But it was only after several weeks, in the creeping blue darkness before dawn, that I understood the true cost of these backward hours. At first, it was subtle. The headstone of Sarah Miller, always one of the first on my morning route, lost the middle initial from her name. The following night, when the clock wound itself back to the hour of her husband's death in 1953, her maiden name disappeared entirely, leaving only Sarah. Within days, other stones began to fade. Birth dates lost their centuries, epitaphs eroded mid-sentence, and entire slabs smoothed themselves out like water-worn river rocks. No rain had fallen, yet the names were vanishing. It was as if the clock's reverse current was pulling the past out of the present, unspooling lives from the fabric of the town. And it wasn't just the stones. The records in my office, once meticulous with each burial logged in black ink, now had blank pages, gaps where entries used to be. I asked lifelong locals about names I was sure had belonged to neighbors, teachers, friends, but all I received were blank looks or the shrug of shoulders. Whole families were being forgotten, not just by the cemetery, but by the memory of the living. The clock in the mausoleum, each time it spun back, erased another trace of the dead, as if undoing the very idea that they had ever existed. One night, driven by dread, I tried to stop the clock. I wrapped my hand around its pendulum just before it could swing, but my fingers passed through the cold brass like it was made of fog. The mausoleum grew impossibly quiet. Outside, the grass had grown impossibly high, covering stones I'd trimmed around just days earlier. I knew then that the clock didn't just mark time for the dead. It rewrote it. And as I flipped through the shrinking logbooks, desperate to recall names already gone, I realized that my own entries had started to blur at the edges. The boundaries between the past and present, between being remembered and being lost, were thinner here than anywhere else. With every turn of that clock, I felt my grip on the world loosen, as if one day soon, I too might vanish from its face and memory, erased by time that only moved in circles. The realization crept over me like frost. I was running out of names, both in the cemetery and in myself. Each time the clock rewound, another life was quietly snuffed from the fabric of the town. Soon, I feared, my own memory would be next. I became obsessed with the East Mausoleum and its ancient clock, sleeping fitfully in my office, waking with the tremor of backward chimes echoing through the stones. The clock was relentless, counting down towards something only it seemed to know. I started marking the walls of my office with every name I could remember, carving letters with a pocket knife as if trying to anchor the forgotten to wood and plaster. But the marks faded within days. The logbook I kept shrank, not just in content, but physically. Pages that once crammed the spine now fluttered loose in my hands, blank and yellowed, as if centuries had passed in a night. My own signature on town rosters vanished, and when I called old friends to ask if they recalled my childhood here, their voices were distant, unsure, and soon lost interest. I was becoming as untethered as the ghosts whose funerals I had tended. The worst came when the clock stopped, for the first time, at 4:12 a.m., precisely the hour of my own birth. In that impossible moment, the world seemed to go silent, the crows on the wall statuesque, the grass unmoving even in the wind. The mausoleum's doors creaked open without my touch. I stepped inside, drawn by a force I couldn't resist, and saw the pendulum frozen, its reflection showing not my face, but a procession of every soul I'd buried, each passing behind me, each turning away as if I was now the one being laid to rest. I reached for the clock, not to stop it, but to set it forward, to break the cycle, to force the time back into its proper direction. My hand met cold glass. As I pushed, the room filled with a blinding sepia light, and every memory I had, names, faces, songs sung over open graves, surged up and out, as if the clock was draining the last remnants of my identity. I felt the years unravel in reverse, my own name slipping away, replaced by silence. When I staggered back into the dawn, the mausoleum was empty. The clock had vanished from the wall. The logbooks were gone. The town's records contained no mention of a caretaker, no signature in my handwriting. I walked through the cemetery as the first light touched the grass, searching for any sign of myself, any proof that I had ever existed. Where my name had been on the registry, there was only a thin groove in the stone, smoothed by time's hand. The mausoleum stood quiet, the clock forever unwound, its secrets finally interred in earth deeper than any grave. And the only record that remained was the silence of names that, for a brief moment, the clock had let slip back into the darkness of memory, a reminder that some secrets, once set loose, belong only to time itself.